Pressing Point. Presented by Stories in Grey. Pressing Point is an introductory fictional short story, maybe even a rom-com. It's a duet narrated by Adam and Dorothy, soundtrack sourced by Donovan, Dream Tunes and X&ND. For those who just need a bit of a nudge, yesterday doesn't have to keep you from where you're going tomorrow.
Prologue, Ben. The Sao Paulo Art Conference wasn't exactly how Ben would have chosen to spend his Tuesday, but when he got the tip about a new, elusive artist revealing her work for the first time, curiosity got the better of him. And as fate would have it, he'd already met her, though he wouldn't realize it until later on. Ben's hands hovered over his phone, his fingertips tapping aimlessly as he stared at the river just outside the cafe's window. It was supposed to be a quick stop, just a quiet moment before the press conference. Sao Paulo's art scene was booming, and today's exhibition was rumored to be groundbreaking. All he needed was a strong coffee to get him into gear. That morning was anything but quiet. The door to the cafe swung open with a slam, and Ben felt the jolt before he even saw her. A blur rushed by, knocking straight into him and sending his coffee sloshing down the front of his white button-up shirt.
"Whoops,"
she muttered, barely glancing at him before darting toward the counter, rifling through the to-go cups, snagging one and racing out. Ben stared after her, stunned, watching her disappear out the door, her hair trailing wildly behind her. "Hey, wait, you just—" But she was gone. Great. His coffee gone, his shirt ruined, and all before he'd even made it to the conference. Hours later, Ben found himself front and center in the packed exhibition hall, adjusting his wrinkled shirt and preparing himself for a long presentation. The artist he was about to meet, Harper Collins, was already well known for her raw, emotion-laden work. He knew the stakes were high. This was her first major exhibition. All he knew was that he'd give her the usual, hard-hitting questions and hopefully get a few exclusive insights. By the time he got himself seated, he couldn't have guessed how much that awkward encounter earlier that morning would matter. And that quirky woman? She was stepping up to the podium.
Chapter 1. Harper. Harper's nerves felt like exposed wires sparking inside her. She'd barely made it to the conference on time, and the whole day had been a disaster from the moment she opened her eyes. Oversleeping, a mad dash to the cafe, then realizing that she'd grabbed someone else's coffee in her panicked rush to get here. And, of course, bumping into that stranger. But today was critical to her career. There was no option but to get through it. She told herself to breathe, to just get through the hour, and then she could fall apart later if she had to. Her fingers gripped the edges of the podium, knuckles white with tension. She raised her eyes, and then froze. Oh no, she thought. Sitting front and center was him. The guy from the cafe, a dark stain still obvious on his white shirt. His eyes were locked on her, with a wicked glare that held a touch more fervor than mere annoyance, making her stomach drop. Harper dropped her gaze, cheeks flushed, gripping the edge of the podium even tighter as her heart raced. She tried to avoid looking at him again, but it was impossible to shake his presence. And he clearly wasn't going to let her ignore him.
Chapter 2. Ben. Ben let out a small, incredulous chuckle. Seriously? This was too good. Ben held her gaze, letting a smirk creep up. He saw her glance down at his shirt and noticed her cheeks flush. She stammered as she began her presentation, clearly uncomfortable, and that just made him hold it longer, watching as she fidgeted under the heat of his stare. Payback was satisfying, even if just a little. When the time came for questions, Ben was the first to speak, his voice a bit sharper than the others. "So, Miss Collins, given the highly personal nature of your work, do you feel any ethical responsibility toward your subjects?" he asked, his tone innocent, though his eyes held a challenge. The room grew quieter, eyes turning toward her as she processed his words. Her throat tightened.
I suppose yes. I feel a responsibility to be truthful to their experiences,
she replied. But don't you think some of your pieces cross the line into exploitation? He pressed, tilting his head, keeping his gaze fixed on her. The longer the questions went on, the more Ben noticed her discomfort, but it was a fascinating thing to watch. This woman, full of artistic talent, couldn't handle the crowd. And maybe he didn't have to go as hard as he was going, but the little hint of payback kept him pressing on. As she stammered through her final answer, she looked like she was at her breaking point. He saw her hands trembling as she gripped the podium, her breaths short and shallow. When the intermission was finally called, Harper practically bolted from the room.
Chapter 3. Harper. Harper bit her lip, shifting uncomfortably, then stumbled through a response. Her heart pounded in her ears, and it felt like every word stuck in her throat. Why him of all people, pushing the hardest, knowing she could barely manage a sentence without faltering? The more she tried to evade him, the more relentless he became, until her composure finally cracked. Barely able to breathe, she muttered a hasty, "Excuse me," and hurried off the stage. She was almost to the hallway before she let out the breath she'd been holding. She wanted to disappear, but she also knew she'd have to return. Her art mattered. This opportunity mattered. But she was exhausted. Exhausted from her mistakes, her own mind, and the past that just wouldn't stay there.
Chapter 4. Ben. Ben leaned back, watching her go. He felt a little conflicted, a mixture of curiosity and concern. And despite everything, he hadn't meant to overwhelm her. She seemed as anxious as she was talented, and maybe he'd pushed too hard. He made his way out, hoping to find her and perhaps smooth things over. Leaving his notebook behind, he wandered the halls, scanning the alcoves and corners until he found her, tucked against the wall, gaze fixed firmly on her shoes. He could see the redness around her eyes, still flustered and defensive. He approached her quietly, hands in his pockets.
Hey, is everything okay? Never seen you this crying. But you told me you're fine, I can tell that you're lying. You've been holding back tears for years, and they're making their way out, on their way to a breakdown. You've been hiding your heart from me. Truth is, if you call, I'm running. I can see where you've been. Can you let me in?
"You all right?" he asked, his voice softer than he'd intended. She looked up, startled, eyes still wide and flustered.
I'm fine.
She trailed off, casting a wary look his way. Ben raised an eyebrow. "You don't look fine." She glared at him, an unexpected fire in her gaze.
Then why did you ask?
Ben felt a small smirk tug at his lips. She had spirit, that was clear. He pointed to the stain on his shirt. "Are you going to apologize for this?" Her glare could have cut glass. She crossed her arms defiantly and said,
Why would I, after that grilling in there?
Ben couldn't help himself. He smirked, crouching down so he was eye level with her. "I guess you really are doing just fine." Her expression softened, and for a split second he thought she might smile, but she quickly turned her head, as if embarrassed by the very idea of it. It was almost endearing, seeing her wrestle with the intensity of her emotions. But something in Ben softened then, his voice dropping to a gentler tone. "Look, I don't know exactly what you're going through, and I know I didn't make it any easier. I'm sorry for pushing so hard." Her gaze lifted toward him, still hesitant but calmer.
Sorry about your shirt.
She mumbled the words, as if admitting them were an act of defeat, but Ben could see a spark of sincerity in her eyes. "Good," he said, looking satisfied. His smirk returned as he said, "So, are you going to tell me why you're hiding here?"
I'm not hiding.
She replied quickly, but even she knew it sounded weak. "Are we doing this again? You look like you're hiding to me," he teased, leaning back against the wall. Something about him, perhaps the persistence in his gaze, made her feel like she could trust him. She sighed, exasperated, but then something shifted in her expression, the vulnerability finally slipping through.
I get nervous. I always have. And there's so much pressure to be, I don't know, perfect? Stronger, maybe.
She took a shaky breath.
Sometimes I don't think I'm capable of this, standing in front of everyone, speaking about my work. It's like every mistake I've ever made is right there with me, dragging me back.
Ben listened, noticing the vulnerability in her voice, the weight of the pressure she was under. He nodded, and when she fell silent, he said, "You know, no one in that room doubts your talent. Sometimes the past and the voices in your head make it feel worse than it is. I can't say I get the art world or everything about what you do, but I get that part, feeling stuck on your mistakes. But I can tell you this. Whatever you did yesterday doesn't have to keep you from where you're going tomorrow." She looked up, and he could see that she was absorbing his words, like she hadn't thought of it that way before. He offered a small smile. "So maybe don't let that past stuff get in the way of what you're capable of now. You've got something unique, and it'd be a shame not to let people see it." She looked away again, blinking as though she were fighting back tears, and managed a faint smile. Then she was silent for a moment, her shoulders loosening just a little. She gave him a tentative nod, and in her eyes he saw the slightest spark of resolve.
Thank you,
she murmured.
Maybe you're right.
Hey, he said with a playful grin, I'm usually right. She rolled her eyes, and her laughter was small but real. And in that moment, Ben realized that this day, stained shirt and all, was going down as one of the best days he'd had in a long time for reasons he didn't really understand yet. And for Harper, maybe it was the beginning of a step forward, the one that could take her beyond her fears, just enough to finish her exhibition, if not her dream. Ben gave her a playful nudge with his elbow. So, think you're ready to head back in? Harper took a deep breath, then nodded.
Yeah, I think I am. Chapter 5. Harper. Back at the podium, Harper's hands were still a little shaky, but the look Ben gave her from his seat was steady, almost grounding. She took a breath, ready to keep moving forward, her past and her anxiety no longer an anchor, but a part of the story she was finally ready to tell.
Chapter 6. Ben. Harper delivered her final presentation with a newfound resolve. The reporters threw questions at her again, but this time she held her own, her voice steady. Ben caught her eye from the crowd and gave her a quick nod. She smiled, just a small smile, but he could see the courage behind it. As he watched her on that stage, Ben realized that perhaps he hadn't just witnessed an art exhibition. He'd seen something even more profound, the courage to face the fear that had held her back, and the possibility of a friendship he hadn't expected. And maybe, just maybe, he'd given her the nudge she needed to keep moving forward.
Thank you for listening to Pressing Point, a short story presented by Stories in Grey.
Everybody says the same things to you. It's just a matter how you solve them, and knowing how to change the things you've been through. I feel I've come to realize how fast life can be compromised. Step back to see what's going on. I can't believe this happened to you. This happened to you.